preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Nadell McGee. I'm the director of the Charles Simon Center for Adult Life and Learning here at the 92nd Street Y. And we wish to thank Barnes & Noble for sponsoring this wonderful series, Books and Breakfast, featuring extraordinary people discussing contemporary life, values, and ideas. And the nice thing about this is that we actually have this event with the lights up so we can see the audience, and that's really a thrill for all of us who are on stage. Usually we look into the black. Excuse us for starting late this morning. There was a little difficulty with transportation. However, we are ready to roll. This morning we have the privilege of welcoming Frank Rich, who became an op-ed columnist for the New York Times in 1994 after having served since 1980 as the paper's chief drama critic. He will be in conversation this morning with our good friend Leonard Lopate, host of WNYC talk show New York and Company. On Wednesday, December 6th, Frank McCourt will be our Books and Breakfast special guest author. And following this morning's discussion, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of our guests. You can write your questions on the cards that are at your places, and they will be collected by our ushers throughout the program. And finally, Frank Rich will be signing copies of his brand new book, Ghostlight, and that is available for purchase right outside this room. Right now, would you please join me in welcoming our two very, very special guests, Frank Rich and Leonard Lopate. Thank you.
Thank you all. I hope you don't mind if I stir this coffee somewhere along the line. Frank, so do you want to start off talking about theater or politics, or according to recent columns, I'm getting the feeling that you think that they're all the same thing anyway.
Well, exactly. Whatever you want to begin with is fine with me.
We could also bring in the World Series.
The World Series, yes. Well, I'm a Mets fan, so... I'm extremely disgruntled, and to make matters worse, during the do or die game tonight, I have to be on a plane to go someplace else to talk about my book. So I'm some non-New York place. So,
well, remember that last night the Jets were behind 30-7, and they won the game. So anything is possible.
Anything's possible, yeah.
Yeah, you grew up Jewish in the suburbs of Washington D.C. Did you have any sense of that as a political town when you were growing up?
It's interesting. I grew up in the suburbs, and then in the city. I moved into the city itself when I was 10 years old. And my father was a retailer. He had actually a family shoe business that had been started by his ancestors not far from the Ford's Theater, where Lincoln was shot, about 4 years after Lincoln was shot. And so to be in that kind of family in Washington would be like being in Beverly Hills in the shoe business. You know, you're not, it's a company town, but you're not part of it. You're on the outside looking in. And so as a kid, you know, you're taken on the tours of Mount Vernon and the White House and the Washington Monument, but it's sort of not really the Washington you live in. And what I lived in was a very kind of conflicted, reform, middle-class Jewish environment that was, I think, doubly apart from the rest of Washington, in part because there was still tremendous restrictive covenants on certain neighborhoods in Washington. When Lyndon Johnson was vice president to Kennedy, at the time, of course, he was promoted to the presidency, to assume the presidency. He was living in Spring Valley, which was a restricted, no Jews allowed neighborhood in Northwest Washington. No one said anything. No one thought anything about it. So it was a different world, and much different from the Washington we know today.
Then you grew up in the Eisenhower years, and then it became the Kennedy years. So Washington even felt sleepier in the early years of your life.
It was very sleepy, and I had a wonderful grandfather on my mother's side who was actually a transplanted New Yorker. He was a Russian Jewish immigrant who moved to Washington during the Depression, but had lived up to then until in Manhattan Beach in Brooklyn. And he loved politics and he hated Eisenhower. And he
Is that where you got started?
I think it's where I got started. He would just, talk about.
Still hate Eisenhower, I understand.
I don't have a strong opinion about Eisenhower actually, but he just, to him he was just a golfer who didn't do anything and didn't have a work ethic, and I think he'd be actually my grandfather Nat would be right at home in this year's political season.
So where did you develop, or how did you develop your love for the theater?
In some ways, that's what Ghostlight is about, although even then I can't say exactly why it happened, but about 1956 or 7, about 56, I guess, when I was 7 years old, my parents took me to a show, as I'm sure many of you have with your kids, and the show was Damn Yankees, which had a touring company playing the one theater in downtown Washington in those days, the National Theater.
Now, these are your father and your mother, not your stepfather.
My father and my
Your stepfather
mother.
didn't come into the scene for another 3 years.
Right, and Damn Yankees was a great show to take me to because I was a Washington Senators fan, and Damn Yankees, as you may recall, is a show about the Washington Senators beating the Yankees, and it's instilled I do hate the Yankees so, to this day, but anyway. At that time, although I don't think I could quite articulate it to myself, I think my parents' marriage was already falling apart, and ultimately they would separate and both remarry, and somehow the theater became for me a fantasy world or an escape that I sort of glommed onto, and I don't quite know. Maybe it could have been baseball itself, or chess, or football, or something. But it was the theater just presented itself to me as something that I wanted to escape into, and very soon after that, in a very young age, I was obsessed with it.
Aided and abetted by your stepfather Joel, who got you a lot of theater tickets.
Right. My mother remarried. Both my parents remarried fairly shortly after they split up, and my mother remarried a very complex, volatile guy who I had obviously never met before he moved into our house.
With his twins.
Who had twin children, a year younger than me. I have a sister, a full sister who's 2 years younger, and his name was Joel Fisher, and he was a Washington lawyer. He's what we now would call a K Street lawyer, sort of Mr. Fix-It, mainly for the aviation, for airlines. He represented a lot of airlines. He also represented actually a lot of Jewish charities, including Ort and Israel Bonds. And somehow he loved the theater. He was also a transplanted Brooklynite, and helped feed my interest in the theater by figuring out ways to finagle me into shows, or taking me to and my sister and my mother to shows.
On the one hand, you have this unhappy relationship. I mean, no kid is happy with a new father, and Joel was a difficult one. He was abusive. He could be violent, but he also was feeding this other side, the side that has played such an important part in your life.
Yeah, the big thing about writing Ghostlight, which was a really, I have to say, really interesting experience for me to write this book, and unlike anything else I've ever done in my career, was to find to what extent this character of my stepfather became a major figure in the book, probably the most major figure in the book after myself.
And your mother.
And my mother.
Helene.
And he was within, to the kids in the family, of whom I was one of four, very difficult figure. I mean, he was an angry guy. He did thrash us and so on. Yet, on the other hand, he was a brilliant guy who loved the theater, which was the thing I loved most in life at that time. And so this book became, part of this book became for me an odyssey of trying to figure out his complexity.
And also dealing with divorce, because you begin the book right after your parents have split up, and the families, your mother and you and your sister are going down to Miami, aren't you? And you're at the airport.
Right. I mean,
and all of the opening parts have to do with adjusting to that divorce.
yes, one thing I wanted to bring back to life in this book was what divorce was like at this particular period of time, because divorce is a fraught subject, obviously, at any time. But in a non-sociological way, really, I wanted to tell the story of what it was like in the late 1950s and early 60s to be in a divorced household, because as I'm sure some of you remember, at that time, divorce, which we think of as such a common practice and ubiquitous today, was something that was sort of just not talked about. Or when people talked about it, they talked about it the way they would cancer. They'd say, at school, you'd hear teachers whispering, that kid's from a broken home. I didn't know a single other child who's a contemporary of mine whose parents were divorced. In fact, it would not be until we all went to college, when everyone's parents got divorced, that the sociological curve would catch up. So I wanted to tell in this book, to some extent, from a child's perspective, what that was like to sort of stand out because of your parental situation.
Have you read Judith Wallerstein's book, in which she talks about how, to her surprise, some people are very upset about this, people retain their feelings about being the children of divorce into their 40s and 50s, in fact, maybe all of their lives, never really resolve them. Now, I got the feeling that may be the case here, or it may just be that you were writing a memoir and you had to go back and revisit a time in your life.
I think I have resolved them, but I think it has taken me years to do it. I haven't read the Wallerstein book, and I'm actually going to read it. I think I want to write about it after the election, probably for my column. I'm not sure I will agree with that. Divorce has a huge impact on everyone involved, is to me beyond debate. Of course it does. To me, this is not necessarily an argument for restricting divorce at all, which is where some people take her findings. I think my parents were right to get divorced. They could have handled it better in terms of the children, but I don't believe that marriages should be kept intact if they're not working.
Let's get to the theater. This is about the development of your love affair with the theater. Now, we're talking about musical theater mostly. We're not talking... I remember when I was a kid, I was in New York, we were given this incredible luxury, tickets for very low amounts to see the great dramas on Broadway. And I saw A Long Day's Journey into Night with Frederick March and Florence Eldridge, and I saw George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan in a great performance, and other things like that. Never really took to musicals, and maybe that's why movies actually wound up my great passion rather than theater. But for you, it was Damn Yankees, and then Bells Are Ringing, and then every other
Music Man. That's what my parents took me. When you're, first of all, also growing up in Washington, which even particularly in those days when there was no subway system, even living in the city is like living in suburbia. You're essentially held captive by whatever your parents want to do. You can't walk to a local theater or take the subway there. And so and as I talk about a bit in the book, I didn't start really branching out until I had my own legs. And then I started to see things like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and the Schofield Lear, some which I talk about in the book. But musicals it was very typical of the time, and it may, what my parents took me to, it also reflects the few years that separate us in age, because take Long Day's Journey into Night, that was 1956. Well, that's when I was 7. I never would have, even if it had been in Washington, I wouldn't have been taken. So
you wouldn't have understood it.
I wouldn't have understood it. Maybe I would have.
I didn't understand it, and I was 17 or something.
And so I missed the great period of Miller, Williams, and the tail end of O'Neill had already happened. And so I happened to come of age in this period that wasn't a particularly great time for plays, but was a great time for musicals, because it was the period of the shows we just mentioned. But once I had my own freedom of movement, I just saw everything indiscriminately and increasingly started going to plays. And also, as I talk about in the book, my mother, even before then, started taking me to plays that came to Washington that she thought I could comprehend, and that often had political meaning. For instance, she took me to Sunrise at Campobello. That was my real first exposure to anything about FDR. And very poignantly, in retrospect, she took me to see Lorraine Hansberry's Raisin in the Sun when it toured and played Washington. And it was very interesting to see that show in Washington, because Washington was still unofficially but segregated, even though it pretended not to be, and it played at a theater that had been officially and famously segregated until about 1954. And so to see that, a play like that in Washington, straight play like that, had a huge effect on me.
So you were seeing the plays that were going through Washington on tryout or coming through on the national tour.
Got it.
And once in a while, you came to New York. And those were binge times. You described one when you were, was it 14 or so?
Yeah, I would... My stepfather was, I don't mean in the clinical sense, but just in terms of his personality, was manic, although maybe also be true in the clinical sense too, and a theater lover. So he would take us up on Christmas vacations to New York. We'd stay at the Astor Hotel, for those of you who remember it, which is where now the Minskoff Theater is, God help us.
And the Hotel Marquis de Sade.
Yes, the Hotel Marquis, that's right, the Hotel Marquis de Sade. That's great. We would see, particularly with extra holiday week matinees, just see everything. And he was completely indiscriminate in what we got tickets for. So we might be seeing a musical in the afternoon, then at night go to see like an Edward Albee play like The Ballad of the Sad Cafe or something like that.
And do you think that all is key to what happened later in your life? At the time, did you have any idea that you were going to use this? Or were you just a kid who read Variety, saved playbills, listened to all the original cast
kids,
albums?
And I know this from my own kids. Kids don't, and I'm sure you know this, kids don't really think in those terms. I mean, if someone had said, what do you want to do for a living? I might have well said fireman or something. I don't know what I said. It never occurred to me that I could have a career of any sort involving this. And frankly, and this again is some of the story of the book, I just had to get through the moment. I had to get through my adolescence. I had a troubled adolescence, and to me the theater was the mental passport out. What I never imagined is it would actually be a transport into a career.
But you did wind up working at the National Theater in Washington. First a ticket seller?
Only a ticket taker. I was a ticket taker because I should explain, I don't know how many of you know Washington, but this was obviously before the Kennedy Center was built. And Washington did have this one tryout house, and it was in a day that's gone now when almost every Broadway show did try out of town. It wasn't so expensive to do. Shows were lighter to move, and almost every 2 weeks, Washington had a new show. Once I could take the bus and get there myself, I started buying standing room, seeing shows over and over again, which actually turned out to be great training to be a critic, because I'd see how these plays would change and how they'd work with them, on them out of town, and replace actors overnight, replace whole scenes. It's fascinating. And I saw great people do this kind of work. But I went so often that at one point when I was in my early teens, the manager of this theater just saw me standing in line for the umpteenth time to buy a ticket to a show that somehow he recognized I had seen me in line before, and pulled me out and said, you don't have to buy a ticket anymore, and then made me a ticket taker, and which meant not only could I see the shows for free, but I actually got paid $4 a week. So, and that to me was as exciting as starring in a Broadway show or whatever, just to take tickets.
But I'm curious, why did you go then to Harvard when you went to college? You could have gone to Columbia or some other school that would have brought you closer to Broadway.
That was actually a deliberate decision. I felt that I was so addicted to the theater that Columbia would have been indeed the obvious place for me to go. And
Never go to class then.
I never go to class, and I think I made a conscious decision not to be in New York because I really thought I would never get through school. I would just be at the theater all the time. And even in Boston, there were 3 or 4 tryout houses in Boston in those days, and it's amazing given everything that was going on at Harvard and my life and the country, how many times I found myself in Tremont Street in downtown Boston going to the theater.
Yeah, another person who came into your life who was very important during your teen years was Moss Hart.
Right, he came into my life
through
the book, not through, I never met him, but my mother was a Book of the Month Club subscriber, and those days when it was a good thing to do, maybe it still is, but and one month, and I remember it vividly, I remember it coming in the brown box, the selection was Act 1 by Moss Hart. It was like 1959 or 60, so I was 10-ish, and she gave it to me to read, and I had never heard of Moss Hart. I was just beginning to sort of devour reading material about the theater, and it was the first adult book I ever read, and I sat down and I recall reading it in one sitting. I know I didn't, but I probably read it in 3 days, and I had such a strong identification with him and that book because, as you may recall, when that book came out, he was the toast of Broadway. He had directed My Fair Lady. He was about to direct Camelot. Of course, he'd written all those plays with George Kaufman, like You Can't Take It With You. But Act 1 only took him up to his very first Broadway play in 1930, even though it was written 30 years later. And it was about how he escaped his childhood into the theater and fought his way out of, in his case, extreme poverty in the Bronx and to Times Square. And
so you felt some kind of
I felt there was some kind of encouragement. If a book can encourage you, and particularly if you're a kid, in feeling that maybe there's a way you can pull yourself out and of your situation and do something. And here was someone taking the exact path, albeit 30 years earlier, that I wanted to take. It was an inspiration to me, and it's also, to a certain extent, an inspiration for Ghostlight.
Did you share this passion for the theater with any of your peers? Were there any kids in school who you talked a lot about this? What about your sister Polly or your sisters, the twins?
Right. They liked it fine, and they weren't forced to go. When we went as a family, they enjoyed it but not in a different way from, say, the way they would enjoy going to a movie or any other kind of event. No one had this obsession, and once, as I became mobile, I became so much more involved with it than they ever did. None of them, took a shine to it the way I did. Among my friends, very few kids went to the theater. Keep in mind, it's Washington, not New York. It was downtown. It was something, it wasn't as expensive as it is now, even in real terms, but it was just not really on the cultural map. I mean, and what I didn't realize at the time and realize now, it was really the beginning of the decline of the theater as a major center of culture and American culture. It was beginning to be dwarfed by not only the movies and television particularly, but also rock music, rock and roll at that time. So it was kind of an anomalous interest, so much so that my mother, in trying to find kids that would share this interest, ultimately sent me to a camp in the Berkshires that she found through an ad in the back of the New York Times Sunday magazine, where which was an arts camp, and it was this wonderful, if somewhat pretentious place in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where for the first time I was exposed to all these New York kids who loved the theater or music or dance or painting, whatever they were doing, who all wore black. And they all went to schools like Elizabeth Irwin and New Lincoln and Music and Art. And it was a whole, I said, oh my God, they're actually kids my age who were interested in this stuff as well.
I was amused to read a review of this book by Cal Thomas, a man I normally wouldn't associate with you. He's a conservative columnist, former employee of Jerry Falwell, the sort that considers Frank Rich one step away from the devil. And he wrote this very affectionate book. He said that he used to get his shoes at the same store that you got your shoes, except that your father owned the store. And that you went to see Barbara Cook together at the Carlisle.
That's absolutely
That's an odd couple.
Yes, it is an odd couple. Cal Thomas is indeed exactly as you describe him. He's a very conservative columnist for the LA Times Syndicate.
When he votes for George Bush, he'll say, because Jesus wants me to do it.
In a way, but I'll tell you what, the reason why I met Cal Thomas was that he actually wrote a book called Blinded by Might. It's a very interesting book. He co-wrote it that came out about 1.5 years ago that I wrote about for my column, or at least talked about briefly in my column, essentially disowning large parts of the religious right, including Falwell, and sort of recanting, he's still very conservative politically, but recanting the idea that religion should be mixed with politics. And in fact, he wrote a terrific column about Bush during this campaign cycle, where Bush, he was interviewing Bush on the plane, and Bush started pandering him and talking to him about religion and Jesus and all that. And Cal Thomas said to him, I don't want to hear about that. I want to hear what you're doing, in the secular world in Washington. But it shows something about the leveling quality of the theater that he wanted to meet me after I wrote this little thing about him. So we met. I had no idea he was a native of Washington, which is unusual. There aren't that many Washington natives. He was this complete theater junkie, and had gone to the National. I didn't know him as a kid, and he's older than I am, but had haunted the National Theater, although never becoming a ticket taker, much as I had. And so indeed, we went to see Barbara Cook together, and we went with our wives, and it was fascinating. He met his wife in community theater. The theater is such an amazing, common bond between people. His wife, who's someone very involved in the hierarchy of a church they belong to, had played Mama Rose and Gypsy in community theater in the Virginia suburbs. There's just no telling about people.
Well, whenever I talk to people about how I'm curious why people wind up in one area or another, why some people are TV junkies, why others just become obsessed by movies, and why others are involved with theater, the theater people always say, well, it's the live aspect of it that really got to me. The fact that every night these people are performing this miracle in front of an audience. How important is that to you?
I think it's enormously important, and I think I wouldn't suggest it gives it artistic superiority, and I also love the movies and plenty of other art forms. But again, part of my story in this book is that because it's live, you feel like there's a reason why a Broadway theater is colloquially referred to as a house. You feel like that you are going into a house that has a familial quality to it. And if you're unhappy with your own family, as I was, even though you don't know the people, to go there and be with an audience, but also live actors on stage who are doing something in common, was a great place to transport my fantasy life into sort of, as it were, have a house away from home.
I want to get to some questions from this audience soon, but let's talk about how people, well, first of all, how did you wind up going from being a ticket taker to the chief drama critic at the New York Times? There must have been some steps in between.
Yeah, it's very, I went to college, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and I actually started acting a little bit. I didn't like it. And then I tried out for the school paper as a drama critic, but there ultimately ended up writing drama reviews, but also writing editorials and running the editorial page and writing political pieces. And that sort of has framed my career ever since. But after I got out of college, I did a whole bunch of conventional things. I worked covering politics. In fact, during the '72 campaign for a paper I helped start with some friends in Richmond, Virginia, where I had some family. And then I came to New York. I worked as an editor, political writer, and film critic for a now defunct magazine called New Times. And then I was a film critic at the old New York Post, the Dolly Schiff Post, and Time magazine. And then the Times hired me, lured me away from Time, really, with the idea that I could write about theater professionally. I'd actually never written about theater professionally until I got to the Times, almost a decade into my career.
Does it bother you that so many people have hated you over the years? After all, you're a nice guy. They called you the Butcher of Broadway, and now there are people in the conservative press, who just consider you to be, well, maybe not as bad as I thought Cal Thomas did, but there's some people. In fact, there was even a campaign against you in the Wall Street Journal and page 6 of the Post.
Yeah, I have. Sure, some of it bothers me. A lot of it doesn't. And there's a certain level of craziness. I have like a hate mail file I show to my kids. You know, it's so amusing. It's so over the top.
Because you don't recognize yourself in the person they've created?
I don't recognize myself, but also, even when I was in school, even when I was in high school, and I briefly talk about this in the book, where I was involved with the school paper and writing editorials, I have caused controversy. It's when the high school paper I ran the school tried to shut it down. So it just seems that no matter what I do, no matter what I'm writing about, I am going to irritate some people, and I can't change myself. So after all these years, I've sort of learned to just accept it.
But you must wonder sometimes why people take it so seriously. For example, you like a play, somebody else doesn't like a play, or you didn't like a play and somebody else loved it. We all recognize that we have different tastes. No, not even the greatest work of art is loved by everybody.
Of course not.
And yet, there would be these angry letters to the Times. Frank Rich is insane. Or any critic is insane. Why do people think that there has to be one judgment, and the judgment is the one that they had?
I've never understood that. Maybe you have a better answer for it. I don't understand it, but it's true, and my friend and successor Ben Brantley gets a lot of the same treatment in the job, and
Margot Jefferson got it. There's also something about the Times that, to some extent, understandably, rubs people the wrong way. It's such a powerful, preeminent institution, and it's a real change even from when I was growing up, when there were 7 fairly healthy papers in New York and a real competitor for the Times and the Herald Tribune. With that gone, and the Times sort of, while there are some other papers obviously, but the Times sort of dominating, being the establishment voice, people are understandably, no matter what you're doing there, they fight with the sports writers, the editorials. But it's more like the restaurant reviewers, the theater reviewers, because they feel that at least those 2 areas, the Times can make or break something. It's true, and they don't even have to be reviews. I was telling some people here earlier, my wife, who's a feature writer for the Times, named Alex Witchell, wrote a really kind of lighthearted piece about 3 or 4 weeks ago about the rise of upscale kosher restaurants in New York, and she wasn't reviewing them. She was just talking about her experiences there, and it's a raft of mail and angry letters and calls, and why did you include this restaurant and not that one, and why didn't you like this restaurant better? And she wasn't even doing as Biff Grimes, our restaurant critic, does, giving them stars, rating these places, luckily for them. And so So you had to go to all of those places with her?
I went to one and I said, take your parents to the rest.
Well, I hear there's a Le Marais, one of them anyway, is
Well, I don't want to get into trouble.
yeah, okay, we won't talk about it. There are some people who feel that you were demoted when you were moved onto the op-ed page. Now,
From theater criticism.
yeah, you have probably the most powerful op-ed presence in the New York Times. Huge, almost half-page articles. You can go on and on and on.
Well, there are two interesting points here. First of all, about that, it was hilarious indeed how theater people reacted to my leaving drama reviewing. It's like, my God, you're going to the op-ed page. Who reads that? It shows
politics.
It shows the parochialism of the theater to a certain extent, and yet there's a parochialism on the other side. The op-ed page is actually, as you can imagine, read by many, many more people than drama reviews. And it's amazing how many people have said to me, what did you do before you were on the op-ed page? They had no idea I was a drama critic. These long articles came about because, in part because of this book. I'd been doing the column for 5 years, and I took a leave to start on Ghostlight, and I found it so satisfying to write something on a bigger canvas that wasn't 700 words that I actually came back and sort of really thinking of leaving the paper and doing something else, and maybe just writing books full time or whatever. And then, much to their credit, from my point of view, and my delight, they created a new form for me where I could write longer, and not just for the op-ed page, but also for the magazine. In fact, I have a big piece coming out this Sunday.
In the classic essay form, these op-ed pieces, because they're not just about one topic. You can use one thing to then go into talking about something else. And just like Hazlitt used to do, you might start off thinking of something amusing and wind up with something very serious.
It's a very exciting form for me. I can't speak for what readers think of it, but it was something that Hal Raines, the editorial page editor, came up with, and it's never been tried before, at least in modern times, in a daily paper. It's literally twice the length, or slightly more than twice the length of a conventional column. It's about 1,400 words. And for me, it's really been rejuvenating.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I know that cards were handed out. Thank you, Deborah. It says here, last year the New York Times featured a poignant article about Stephen Sondheim. He expressed that musical theater has changed forever. Do you agree?
I wrote that piece.
Would you agree with Sondheim?
Yeah, it had.
Some people thought he was just a little bitter. I remember
bitter.
speaking to James Lapine about it, and he said, well, Steve, and
Sondheim is, by definition, whatever age he is, and this was on the occasion of his turning 70, a pessimistic, somewhat dour guy. I mean, he is the man who wrote Sweeney Todd. It's not like he's sitting around. If he'd written Hello, Dolly, we might be surprised at his personality. But what he says is, to a certain extent, true. I think it's correctable. I don't agree. I agree with his framing of the problem. I'm not sure if I feel that the diagnosis is terminal. The problem is that musicals have become so expensive to produce, and therefore are more or less run by corporations, because they're the only ones who can afford to produce them when they're $12-13 million. And what that means is that the next generation of Steve Sondheims or Kander and Ebbs or whomever can't get their work on, because if you're a corporation and we're going to sink $10 million plus into a Broadway show, you're going to do something tried and true to make sure you get your money back, whether it be a revival or a spectacle like The Lion King. And so the days when a producer like Hal Prince would have 300 investors to take a chance on a new composer lyricist to do the pajama game with, and most of the money was small checks from doctors in New Jersey or what have you, that's gone. But it means that it's very hard for young and new talent to get a show on. It happens, but not as often as it should.
I had a panel here, Charles Strauss,
Right.
James Lapine, and Susan Stroman, and to my great surprise, they didn't want to hear any criticism of Andrew Lloyd Webber. They feel that he's much maligned, that he's actually done more good than harm.
I'm not a fan of Lloyd Webber's, but I don't think he can be accused of creating this situation in the Broadway theater. It's not his fault. And you could argue, as perhaps some of the people in your panel argued, and certainly as, say, the Schuberts would argue, that Cats and the British shows that followed really helped keep the Broadway theater alive in the early 80s when things were really falling apart and there was very little production. So it brought new audiences into the theater.
I have a real problem here. Every one of these questions is really good, and we don't have all that much time. I'm going to try to rush through them.
Go ahead. I'll try to be.
You have an uncanny ability to associate seemingly unrelated events and use them to draw a conclusion in your column. Do you search for these associations or come by them naturally? In other words, do they just flow out?
I appreciate the compliment, but I come by them naturally. And indeed, to some extent in this book, when I was revisiting my childhood, I discovered how it happened to me as a kid. I think going to the theater and sort of seeking refuge in the theater as much as I did forced me to make connections, in that case, between art, if you will, and life, and figure out the world with my head to some extent when I wasn't getting guidance elsewhere.
You also have talked a lot about how art and politics have, in recent years, clashed a bit. When you were growing up during the Eisenhower years, we assumed that Eisenhower had never been to a play, never been to a museum, and nobody thought twice about it.
Well, in fact, Eisenhower never did go to a play. I know no, because I know that it's.
But he was in the European Theater of Operations.
Right. Yes, he was in the real life South Pacific. He wasn't in the South Pacific actually. Real life Mr. Roberts or whatever. Washington abhors culture. I'd say the way nature does a vacuum. Even now, when politicians go to Kennedy Center, they're dragged there, for the Kennedy Center honors or for fundraisers or something. But increasingly, and we've certainly seen it this year, we've seen it really throughout the past decade, politicians at least know they've got to take some account of the culture. It may take the dubious form of them railing against Hollywood without actually having seen any of the movies or against music, or it takes the more obvious form of them campaigning on Leno and Letterman and Oprah and all the rest of it. However, I don't think this year's crop of candidates, any more than any previous one, has any great connection to culture.
Recently, there have been a spate of articles about how most Americans now are getting their political information, not from the news, but from Leno and Letterman.
And perhaps with good reason.
Well, that's a real responsibility for Leno and Letterman. They have to stick in they can't just make up some news story. They actually have to start off with a real news story. Otherwise, who knows, it'll be an Orson Welles thing all over again.
Well, you're right. And actually, I was fascinated when Bush went on Letterman last week.
Letterman gave him a hard time.
Letterman had boned up on some issues and was asking about drilling for oil in Alaskan preserves and the death penalty. I almost fell out of the bed. I couldn't believe it.
Well, these are two questions that are related. What pushed you into a liberal political position, and what are we liberals to do if Mr. Bush becomes president, God forbid? Please discuss politics. Who's going to win the presidency? I'm always afraid of those. Marty Glickman told me this wonderful story. The first World Series he ever did, he did with Red Barber, and he asked Red, who's going to win? And Red said, that's why they play these games, Marty.
That's great. I love that story.
So, are you making predictions?
I'm not. I've always felt this was Gore's election to lose. He is an incumbent in a time of tremendous prosperity and peace, more or less. And if he does lose this election, and he's running against someone who, whatever one thinks of him, was unknown except by name to most Americans a year ago, and has had very limited experience in public office and only in one state. And I'm not even saying it pejoratively. I mean, that's just a fact. So if Al Gore loses this election, it will be studied by historians forever as one of the most incredible screw-ups in the history of American politics. Having said that, I'm not convinced he's going to lose, and as the papers indicate this morning, the race is tightening again. It's hard to know how to read these polls, and in some ways they're irrelevant because it doesn't really matter. They're national polls, and it doesn't really matter what the numbers are in New York, or Gore is going to take. It really matters in about 10 states, and I don't think anyone knows. The press, by and large, thinks that Bush is going to win. I mean, that's certainly the feeling in my profession, and as startled as anyone else. But anything could happen. There's going to be a low turnout, so it may be who shows up. It is not, however, whatever happens, it's not going to be decided by the votes of people in this room if you're registered in New York in the presidential race.
Did you see the Joan Didion piece in the New York Review of Books in which she suggests that the press has no idea, and neither do the political professionals, what really goes on?
I love that piece, and I commend it to you, to all of you who haven't seen it.
Best piece on politics in years, I think.
And actually, I referred to it in my column on Saturday. She makes the point, and she puts her finger on one of the things that has gone completely wrong with the Gore campaign. The same Washington pundits and bloviators, as I call them, who during the entire time of the impeachment said this is the end of, first they said it's the end of the Democratic Party, then they said it's going to force Clinton from office, and then to a man and woman, they all predicted a Republican landslide in the off-year elections of '98 and were proven wrong. Gore has now listened to the advice of these people who have told him, in essence, to run away from Clinton. So this untested theory that has been promulgated by all the people you watch on Sunday mornings for 2 years now.
Character and values.
Character and values are going to win this thing, which has done nothing but lead Republicans to defeat. And in '98, most of the big religious right candidates, including incumbents like Louch Faircloth in South Carolina, lost at the height of impeachment, the height of the Lewinsky scandal. So it says something about the Gore campaign that they've listened to this same bad advice. It's like a sucker punch, and he can't mention Clinton's name, and he can't even take credit for the good things that happened in the 8 years that Gore was a partner in this administration.
What drama would you suggest for an 11-year-old boy who has seen only musicals?
11 years old, I think you can take a kid to almost anything that you think is good. I can't pull a title up of something that's running right this minute. I'm sure if I had the paper, I could suggest some things. But what I learned as a kid, and I learned it with my own kids too, is you've got to treat children. You can't condescend to them in making theater choices. And once they get to certainly the age of 11, but even a little bit younger, you can take them to Shakespeare, take them to Arthur Miller, take them.
What about Bill Irwin in the
Bill Irwin,
Beckett text? Right.
You've got, even if the kids don't understand it all intellectually. I remember being taken to Shakespeare when I was 8 years old. I didn't understand much of the language, but I still remember it because theater, one of the great things about theater is it can work almost subliminally or subconsciously. And I remember taking my older son when he was 8 to see Nicholas Nickleby, the revival of it, and he didn't know who Dickens was, but he loved the idea of an 8-hour marathon, and so that sort of got him there. It sounded like a contest, and he still remembers it. You know, he's now a junior in college, and now he loves Dickens, and he doesn't remember all the details, and people were looking askance at him in the audience when he was there, but it was a great thing for him. So I would say take the child to something you think is good, not something that's good for kids.
I'm not sure that this is 100% true, but it says, it is so unusual for a straight man to care about the rights of gays and lesbians. What is the genesis of your concern other than the most obvious issue that is human rights?
The genesis of, I don't know if it's so unusual for straight people to get involved in this issue, or it's becoming less and less unusual. But the genesis...
But people people assume that if a straight person says something about gays that isn't judgmental, that he may be gay. I mean, that's happened to me more than 3,000 times.
It's silly, and I think that's changing too. But I think there are three explanations for my interest and my passion about this issue. First of all, as the easiest one to explain is as a theater critic in the 1980s, as I was covering plays, AIDS was an exploding story right before my eyes. It became part of the beat. Major artists in the theater dying of the disease, and other major artists writing about it. And I think for myself, as for many Americans, it was sort of a wake-up call. What is going on not only with this disease, but why are people afraid to talk about it and afraid to talk about their having this disease because they're afraid to talk about their sexual orientation. But in writing this book, I realized that there were things that happened in childhood that ultimately, although it took years for me to figure them out, had a big effect. One was my parents' divorce. One thing I talk about in this book is that when my parents were getting divorced, not only, as I said before, did no one talk about divorce in the neighborhood, but the whole culture didn't acknowledge it happened. I was a big TV watcher. I watched Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver, all these shows, and My Three Sons. You never saw a divorced family. I kept looking, nor did you in the movies. You saw Doris Day and Rock Hudson. I kept looking for some representation of what I thought was a sort of terror in my life, and I never found it. Now we forget that day existed because divorce is all through our culture. I think that idea of having something that's very intimate and intrinsic to you and your family life being closeted, I think that gave me something of an identification with this issue, because I remember what it was like to be not being able to say aren't married to each other anymore. And while it's different from sexual orientation, I think there's a real analogy there. The other thing is that there's a major character in my book whom I met as a ticket taker, who was a traveling manager with Broadway shows on the road, and who befriended me when I was a kind of screwed up teenager, and really kind of played a parental role, perhaps more so than my parents did, particularly in the crucial years when I was in high school. At the time, I didn't even know anything about homosexuality. I didn't know really, the word gay, of course, wasn't in the lexicon that I knew. And I realize now in retrospect that this guy was gay, that he was someone who didn't have children of his own, in fact pretended to be heterosexual, and yet played this very altruistic, almost fatherly or big brotherly role with me that changed my life and helped me escape out of Washington. And I realized, when I started doing this book, he died in the early 80s. I assume of AIDS, but I don't know it for a fact. Here was a guy not famous, but worked in the theater, who had to live a life that was in part a lie and was also a great person who did a lot for me. And I feel there are a lot of people like that. They're teachers, they're people like that who were in those days closeted and had to hide in society, who have not been recognized. And it seems to me that in this day and age, it's terrible that situation has to go on at all, that gay people, and it's happening less and less, particularly in a place like New York, have to be closeted and can't be acknowledged as family members, people playing an important human role in our society.
We've run out of time, but I'm going to ask you just one more of the questions. Do you regret moving from theater to politics or social criticism or whatever you think you're doing now?
Whatever I think I'm doing? No, I mean, by the time I left being theater critic, I wish I had sort of left it earlier. It's like I feel like let out of a box to be able to write about anything I want, including the theater when I want to, like the Sondheim piece or whatever.
But you did it for so long, too.
I did it for so long, and I couldn't imagine doing it again, going and just reviewing play after play. And also, I'd said everything I had to say. I don't have a lot more to say than what I said about David Mamet or Tom Stoppard or whatever.
Well, I want to thank you so much.
Thank
Frank
you.
Rich has been great. I think you've been wonderful. Deborah,
Thank you.
Nadel McGee, Emily Hoffman, thank you all. And Frank will be signing books now.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.